On a quiet morning, Rachel stepped onto the plane with the usual air of determination. She was young, sharp, and always ready to tackle the long hours of serving passengers. But this day felt different. As she scanned the cabin before taking her position, she noticed him, an elderly man, making his way slowly down the aisle. He was tall, with a stoic expression on his face, his gait uneven and deliberate. His left hand clutched a cane that seemed to be his only support as he moved past rows of passengers that barely spared him a glance. She didn't think much of it at first. Just another old man flying alone, she figured. But there was something about him that made her pause for a split second. It wasn't the cane, though it was something deeper, the way he carried himself, like someone who had seen things that most people could never imagine. He wore an old military jacket, one that seemed faded with age, and a veteran cap perched atop his head. As he passed, Rachel caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were clear and piercing, though the rest of his features were marked with age. His wrinkles ran deep like the lines on an old map. But it was his eyes that unsettled her. There was something in them that made her feel small for reasons she couldn't understand. He made his way toward the front of the plane and took a seat in the first-class section. His movements slow but purposeful. Rachel shook the thought away and adjusted her uniform with a sigh. She had passengers to attend to, and this wasn't her first time working with elderly or disabled passengers. She had seen it all before, but as she began preparing the drink cart and moving down the aisle, she couldn't stop glancing at him. She knew she shouldn't stare, but something about him intrigued her, the way he held himself, so composed despite his age and condition, as if he had a story to tell, but wouldn't share it. Rachel couldn't help it. She was used to dealing with all sorts of personalities on the plane, but this man felt different, more present, more grounded, like his presence had weight beyond the simple fact that he was an old man on a flight with a cane. She had dealt with veterans before, many of them older now, some still bearing the scars of their service, but she couldn't recall anyone who had the same quiet air of authority this man exuded. She adjusted her posture and tried to focus on her tasks. The flight was getting busier, and passengers were starting to settle in. Some of them were already chatting in low voices about their destinations. As Rachel moved through the cabin, she noticed the veteran hadn't taken off his jacket, though the cabin was warm and people around him were relaxing and chatting. She could see him sitting there, staring out the window, his hands resting on his lap, fingers slightly curled, as if they had been that way for years. And Rachel caught herself wondering what had caused that, what had happened to him. What did he carry with him under the jacket, under the hat, under those eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of experiences? She tried to shake the thought away, but couldn't help it. There was something about him that made her wonder if she had misjudged him already, if he was just another lonely old man, or if there was something deeper to his presence, something she had yet to figure out. As Rachel moved down the aisle, she continued to glance at the man. His presence lingered in her mind, his silence almost as loud as the chatter of the other passengers around her. It was hard to ignore him, the way he sat there, so still, so composed, as if he was in a world of his own. While the flight buzzed around him, she focused on her tasks, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. But it was impossible not to notice him. He was a contrast to the hustle of the rest of the cabin, a living piece of history sitting there. And yet he remained out of place, his eyes still staring ahead, unblinking. He didn't fidget or check his watch like others did. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. Was he remembering something? Was he reliving a moment in time that no one else could understand? She felt an odd sense of guilt wash over her, and though she couldn't quite pinpoint why, she suddenly felt like she had already judged him before even speaking to him. The thought made her uncomfortable, and she forced herself to shake it off with a quick smile to the passengers around her. She had a job to do. She moved further down the aisle and offered drinks to the passengers. When she reached the man in first class, she paused. She was aware of his presence before she even reached his row. He hadn't shifted in his seat or acknowledged her as she arrived at his row, but there was something about the way he held himself that made her hesitate. She looked at him for a brief moment, but didn't speak immediately. Her eyes fell to the tray table in front of him. It was folded up and clean, unlike the ones in other seats, where passengers had strewn their belongings across the surface. She noticed his hands for the first time. They were steady, strong, and yet worn by years of use. His right hand rested on the armrest, but his left hand was curled slightly near his knee, the fingers rigid, as if they had long ago forgotten the ease of movement. She felt a pang of sympathy, but quickly pushed it aside. What did she owe him? She asked herself. He was just another passenger who needed a drink or something to eat. But there was something in the way his eyes locked with hers. When she finally spoke, it was as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. She offered him a polite smile and asked if he needed anything. He looked at her, but didn't speak for a moment. His eyes seemed to search hers, and Rachel felt an odd unease settle in her chest. She waited a little longer, but the veteran didn't respond. Instead, he gave a small nod and adjusted his seat slightly without saying a word. It was a movement so subtle, so quiet, that it almost felt like an accusation. Rachel felt her smile falter as she moved to the next passenger. Something about the brief exchange lingered in the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed to meet his gaze with the respect it deserved. But why? She thought, shaking her head. She had seen it all before. She had dealt with veterans, passengers with all kinds of issues, and this was just another flight. But as she moved through the cabin, a small knot formed in her stomach. She couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about the way he sat there, unmoving. His presence seemed to fill the space around him. The veteran remained silent as the rest of the flight carried on, the noise of the cabin buzzing around him. But he didn't react to it. He just stared ahead, as if he was lost in another world, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder if that was true, if he was really lost in a place far beyond the confines of the plane, or if the past was weighing on him so heavily that nothing in the present could ever reach him. As Rachel moved through the cabin, she kept glancing back at the veteran, wondering why she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He hadn't said a word to her since she offered him a drink, and yet she couldn't escape the tension in the air around him. It was as if his silence spoke louder than any words could. His eyes never left the window, and the closer Rachel got to him, the more she felt drawn to his stillness, but also an unease that she couldn't explain. She shook her head, trying to focus on the other passengers and get back into her routine. She stopped in front of row after row, offering drinks and snacks, politely smiling at the people who didn't seem to notice her inner turmoil. But when she finally reached the row where the veteran sat again, she paused for a moment. Her hands gripped the cart a little tighter, and she found herself holding her breath for some reason. The closer she got to him, the heavier the air felt. She wasn't sure if it was the sheer presence of the man or the guilt slowly building inside her. From the moment she had spoken to him earlier, it had been subtle at first, just a feeling, but now it was turning into something more tangible, something she couldn't ignore any longer. She knew she had made a mistake already, a small one, but it had bothered her. From the start she had been sharp with him when he needed help, and her tone had been more dismissive than she intended. The thought of him struggling with his seatbelt earlier made her cringe a little. She had meant to help him, not make him feel small or awkward, but her impatience had gotten the better of her, and now she couldn't get the image of his face out of her mind, the quiet resignation in his eyes when she had rolled her own and walked away. It haunted her now. She reached his row, and without thinking she cleared her throat and gave him another tentative smile. "Excuse me, sir. I just wanted to make sure you have everything you need," she said, her voice softer than before. Her words almost seemed to hang in the air. Between them she watched for a moment, as the veteran didn't react right away. He didn't shift in his seat or look at her. Instead, he continued staring out the window as if she wasn't even there. Rachel felt the words sit heavy in her chest as she waited for a response. When it didn't come, she felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't know what she expected, but his complete lack of acknowledgement only made the moment more uncomfortable. She glanced around quickly at the other passengers to see if anyone was watching her. They were all engaged in their own little worlds, but the silence between her and the veteran seemed to grow louder the more she stood there awkwardly unsure what to do next. She tried again, this time her voice steadier. "Sir, if you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know." The words felt weak, even to her ears, but they were all she could muster. She didn't expect him to respond immediately, but when he did finally turn his head slightly, it was enough to make Rachel's heart skip a beat. His eyes met hers, and this time there was no subtle glance or distant stare. They locked on each other for a long moment, and Rachel's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his gaze, something that told her he knew exactly what she had been thinking. The guilt that had been gnawing at her seemed to spill out in that one moment, and she couldn't help but feel exposed. She hadn't meant to offend him, but here she was standing before him, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. He didn't say anything in return. Instead, he simply nodded once before returning his focus to the window. And just like that, the moment was over, but Rachel could feel the weight of it linger in the air around her. It was as if in that brief exchange something had shifted, something that would make her rethink everything she had assumed about this man. Rachel moved on quickly, her heart still racing from the brief moment of eye contact with the veteran. The weight of his gaze felt like a heavy hand on her chest, and she couldn't shake it. She tried to focus on the other passengers around her, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. His silence was unsettling in a way that she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't that he was rude or unpleasant, but something about the way he carried himself made her feel like she had intruded on a world she wasn't meant to be a part of. It wasn't until she was halfway down the aisle that Rachel realized just how much his presence had affected her. She was trying to ignore it, but there was something deep inside her nagging at her, telling her she hadn't done enough. She hadn't truly apologized, not yet, not in a way that would make up for the sharpness in her tone earlier. She couldn't stop replaying the moment when he had asked for help with his seatbelt. She had been impatient with him, and that thought made her stomach churn. What kind of person did that to a man who had already sacrificed so much? But at the same time, Rachel couldn't help but wonder why he hadn't said anything, why he hadn't reacted when she had been cold and dismissive. Why didn't he speak up? Wasn't it his right to demand respect? She told herself it wasn't her fault that he didn't speak up, but deep down she knew better. There was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that he was letting her off easy, that he knew something about her that she didn't want to face. The flight continued as Rachel made her rounds, but the rest of the cabin felt distant, almost like a blur. She smiled at the passengers and answered their questions, but her mind kept drifting back to him, the veteran who hadn't said a word, but who had somehow made her feel so much more guilty than anyone else could have. She couldn't understand it. She was a good flight attendant. She took pride in her work, and yet here she was feeling like a fraud. She glanced back at him. When she thought no one was looking, he hadn't moved much since the last time she'd seen him, his eyes still focused on the window, though his hands seemed to have shifted slightly. They rested now on the armrests, as if he was ready to stand at any moment. Rachel took a deep breath and walked back to the galley to grab more drinks, but the guilt still gnawed at her. She couldn't stop thinking about him, his eyes, his stillness, his quiet dignity. She thought about her own life, and how easy it was to forget the struggles of others, how easy it was to dismiss someone because they didn't fit the image of what she expected a hero to be. But this man was different. He wasn't loud, he wasn't demanding, he didn't ask for anything more than what he needed. And that made her realize how much she had taken for granted, how much she had assumed about the people around her. When the plane finally began its descent into New York, Rachel's heart felt heavier than ever. She couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She had been wrong in her judgment of him. She had been wrong in how she treated him. And now she couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to fix it. She stood by the front of the cabin waiting for the seatbelt sign to turn off. When she saw him again, He was standing now, his cane in hand, and he was slowly making his way toward the front of the plane. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she watched him move despite the stiffness in his limbs. He walked with a quiet strength, with the kind of grace that made her feel small. She wondered how many others had missed the story behind the eyes of this man, how many had overlooked him simply because he didn't fit the mold of a typical hero. She knew she had to say something now, but words seemed to fail her. As he came closer, she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she simply watched as he passed her, by the quiet weight of his presence still hanging in the air. As Rachel watched the veteran slowly make his way toward the front of the plane, her thoughts raced. She wanted to say something to apologize, to make up for her earlier behavior, but the words seemed to be stuck in her throat. She stood frozen for a moment, her eyes locked on him as he moved with slow, deliberate steps, his cane tapping softly against the floor with each movement. Despite the apparent struggle in his walk, there was a dignity in the way he carried himself, something that seemed to command respect. Without uttering a single word, Rachel couldn't help but feel ashamed. She had been impatient with him earlier. She had brushed him off as just another old man in her routine. But there was so much more to him than that. She could feel the weight of the silence between them, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she wasn't used to. She knew it was wrong to judge him without knowing anything about him, but she had done it anyway. She had seen the cane and the military jacket and assumed things about him that were not true. She had seen him as a problem to be dealt with rather than a person with a life and a story that she couldn't even begin to understand. As the veteran reached the front of the cabin, he paused for a moment, glancing toward the cockpit before turning to face the aisle Rachel was standing in. He caught her eye again, and this time it wasn't just a glance. It was as if he was waiting for her to speak, but the words still wouldn't come out. Instead, she felt her heart race as she took a step forward, the tension between them hanging heavy in the air. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the veteran spoke first. His voice was low but steady, and when he spoke it was like the rest of the world fell away. The hum of the plane, the soft murmur of the passengers, none of it seemed to matter anymore. His words cut through the noise, and Rachel felt herself hold her breath in anticipation. "I know you're sorry," he said, his voice rough but firm. Rachel blinked in surprise, her breath catching in her chest. Her eyes widened as she looked at him, unsure how to respond. He had spoken before she could apologize, before she could even say the words she wanted to say. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. He had known all along, hadn't he? He had known from the moment she had spoken to him with impatience, from the moment she had dismissed him as just another old man on a plane. But instead of confronting her, he had said nothing until now, and that made Rachel feel even smaller than she already did. She could feel her face flush with embarrassment and guilt, but she still couldn't find the right words to express what she was feeling. She tried again, but her voice faltered. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to." She stopped herself, unsure of how to explain her behavior, how to apologize for something that felt too big to apologize, for she couldn't even find the words to express how wrong she had been, how much she regretted her actions. The veteran's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment Rachel saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. There was no anger, no resentment, just understanding, as if he knew exactly what she was going through. And for a brief moment she wondered if he had been in situations like this before, if he had ever been misunderstood or misjudged by someone who didn't know the whole story. Rachel could feel the weight of his gaze again, and this time it wasn't judgment. It was something else, something deeper, something that made her want to shrink back and hide at the same time. It made her want to listen. It made her want to hear his story, to understand who he really was and what had brought him to this moment. But as quickly as it came, the moment passed, and the veteran gave her a small nod. "I've seen more than you can imagine," he said, his voice softer now, but still full of strength. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. His words hit her harder than she expected. She could tell there was so much more to him than she had ever realized, There was a story behind the eyes of this man, a story she could never truly understand, no matter how hard she tried. She stood there for a moment, just staring at him, unsure of what to say next, unsure of how to make this right, unsure if she even could. Rachel stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. Her heart pounded in her chest as the veteran's words echoed in her mind. She had never expected him to speak like that to her. He wasn't angry or upset. He didn't even seem bothered by her previous behavior. But there was something in his tone that made her feel small. She wanted to speak, to say something that would make it right, but the words just wouldn't come instead. She felt the weight of everything she had assumed about him crash down on her. All at once she had seen him as just another elderly man traveling alone, nothing more than a passenger to deal with a problem to be solved. But now everything had changed, and she realized how wrong she had been, her stomach twisted with guilt. And she had to force herself to take a breath to steady herself. But it didn't help. She still felt like she was standing in front of a mirror seeing the version of herself. She didn't want to acknowledge the one who had judged someone without knowing anything about them, the one who had treated someone with the same indifference she had seen so many others treat others. In the past, the veteran's quiet presence had made her confront all of that, and she didn't know how to deal with it all. She finally found her voice, though it came out more quietly than she intended. "I'm sorry," she said, her words almost lost in the hum of the plane. She had meant them more than she could put into words, but she wasn't sure if he would even hear her, or if it mattered, if he did at all for a moment. The veteran didn't respond. He simply stood there looking at her, his eyes unwavering, and for a brief moment Rachel thought maybe he hadn't hurt her. But then he nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully, and in that moment she realized just how much wisdom and experience this man carried with him, how many battles he had fought in his life, how many stories he had kept hidden behind that quiet gaze. His eyes were filled with things she could never imagine. But somehow he didn't hold any bitterness or anger toward her. Instead, he seemed to understand exactly what she was feeling, and that made Rachel feel even more exposed. She wanted to ask him about his life, about his service, about everything he had been through, but she didn't know where to start. The words felt inadequate for what she wanted to say instead. She stood there awkwardly unsure if he would speak again, unsure of what else she could possibly do. But after a few more moments of silence, the veteran spoke again. His voice was still steady, but there was a calmness in it that made Rachel feel both at ease and more anxious at the same time. "I'm not mad at you," he said, his words simple but meaningful, and Rachel felt a weight lift off her chest at those words. They weren't what she had expected to hear. They weren't an apology, or even an acknowledgement of the wrong she had done, but they were enough to make her realize that maybe she hadn't completely ruined the moment. Maybe she hadn't completely ruined her chance to make things right. She looked at him carefully and saw how he carried himself with such quiet strength. There was nothing in him that wanted to take anything from her, no anger, no judgment, just a man who had lived through things she couldn't even comprehend. And in that moment she realized that he wasn't just a veteran or a man with a story. He was someone who had accepted what he had been through and didn't need anyone's validation to feel at peace with himself. She felt a strange sense of admiration for him in that moment, and a deep sadness for her own ignorance. She had been so quick to judge him based on appearances, but now she saw him as more than just a passenger on a flight. He was a person with a past and a dignity that was earned through lived experience. She wanted to ask him about his life, what he had been through, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She was still too ashamed of how she had treated him earlier. Instead, she simply nodded back at him, unable to find the words, but hoping that somehow her gesture would say everything she couldn't express. The silence between them stretched on, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, a quiet bond that had formed without either of them having to say much. Rachel stood there feeling as if the world around her had faded away. Just for a moment, it was as though time itself had stopped. and she was standing in the presence of something much bigger than herself, bigger than this flight, bigger than the role she played on the plane. She had always seen herself as a good person, someone who treated others with respect. But in that moment she realized how often she overlooked the stories of the people around her, how often she judged them based on their appearance or their circumstances, without ever really taking the time to understand who they truly were. And now, standing in front of this man, this veteran, she felt the weight of her own ignorance. She felt small, and yet somehow humbled, as if the universe was reminding her of something important that she had forgotten somewhere along the way. It was a lesson she didn't know she needed, but one that would stay with her long after this flight was over. She took another breath, this time steadier than before, and looked at him again. Her heart was still heavy with the guilt of her earlier actions. But there was also something new, something that hadn't been there before, something that made her feel more connected to him, more aware of the depth behind his eyes. She wanted to speak, but the words didn't seem enough. So she simply nodded again, letting the silence fill the space between them. And for the first time she felt a sense of peace. She didn't need to explain herself to him, or to anyone else for that matter. He wasn't looking for an apology. He had already moved beyond that. He had seen things in his life that would break most people, but he stood there still and strong, as though nothing could shake him. She realized now that his silence wasn't out of anger or disappointment. It was out of strength. It was a strength that came from living through things most people would never understand. He didn't need her to acknowledge his pain, because he had already made peace with it. And in a way that made Rachel feel even more ashamed. She had judged him without knowing the first thing about what he had endured. And now she realized how little she truly knew about the world around her, how easy it was to make assumptions, and how wrong those assumptions could be. The veteran was still standing before her, still quiet, still composed, and Rachel wondered what his life had been like, what had shaped him into the man who could stand here so calmly in the face of everything he had endured. She imagined the battles he had fought, the losses he had suffered, and the sacrifices he had made, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward him for all he had given to his country and to the world. Even if no one had ever truly seen him for who he was, she felt herself grow more reflective with each passing second. And when the silence stretched too long for comfort, she finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, but filled with sincerity. "Thank you for your service." She said the words felt simple, but they came from the heart. And as she said them, she realized how much she meant them, how much she needed to say them, not just to this man, but to every veteran, every person who had ever given a part of themselves for something bigger than their own lives. She wasn't sure if he would acknowledge her words, or if he would even respond, but when he did speak, it wasn't what she expected. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, his voice low and quiet. And for the first time, Rachel truly understood the depth of his strength, his humility, the weight of his years, the lives he had touched without anyone ever realizing who he was. And she felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes stinging. She had spent so much of her life caught up in the small things, the day-to-day struggles, that now seemed so insignificant compared to the quiet dignity of this man. And she couldn't help but feel the profound sense of gratitude she had been searching for her whole life, a gratitude for the lessons she had learned in this moment, for the reminder that sometimes the most important things in life weren't the ones that demanded the loudest attention. As the plane began its final descent, Rachel found herself lost in thought, her mind still reeling from the moment she had just shared with the veteran. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavily on her heart, as if the universe had shifted her perspective. In an instant she looked around at the other passengers, but they all seemed to be preoccupied with their own thoughts, their own little worlds. And for a moment Rachel felt like an outsider in the crowd, the only one who had truly seen something that others had missed, something that had been right in front of them all along. And as she looked back at the veteran, she realized that there was so much more to his story than she would ever know, but she had seen enough to understand him in a way that would stay with her forever. The plane began to land smoothly, but Rachel barely noticed the change in altitude. She was too deep in thought. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly she had judged him, how easily she had dismissed him as just another old man traveling alone. And now she understood how wrong she had been, how easy it was to overlook the stories that each person carried with them. Each person was a story, a lifetime of experiences that shaped them into who they were. And in that moment, Rachel vowed to never again make assumptions about someone based on their appearance or their circumstances. She would listen more. She would see people for who they truly were, and not just as problems to be solved or tasks to be checked off her list. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, Rachel began her final checks. Before the passengers began to disembark, she walked down the aisle one last time and paused when she reached the veteran's seat. He was already gathering his belongings, preparing to leave. But this time Rachel didn't feel the unease that had plagued her before. This time she felt a sense of respect and understanding. She didn't need to say anything more to him. She didn't need to apologize again, because somehow she knew that her acknowledgement had already reached him. She simply nodded as she passed him. And as she did, she saw a small smile flicker on his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let her know that he had forgiven her, that he understood, that she had learned from the encounter. And that was all he needed to know. Rachel's heart lightened just a little as she made her way to the front of the plane, her mind still processing everything she had learned and experienced over the past few hours. The flight attendant's job was to serve and to care for the passengers. But Rachel now understood that sometimes the best service wasn't about providing drinks or snacks. It was about seeing people for who they were and treating them with the respect they deserved. The veteran had taught her that lesson without even trying, without saying a single word. He had shown her what true strength looked like in the quiet moments, the moments when no one was looking. Rachel felt grateful for that lesson, and she knew it would stay with her for the rest of her life. As she watched the passengers file off the plane one by one, she felt a deep sense of appreciation for them all. Each person who walked past her carried a story, and Rachel promised herself that she would take the time to hear those stories. She wouldn't be the person who judged or dismissed again, because in every face there was a history, a lesson to be learned, and she would be better for it. The veteran had given her more than just an apology or a lesson. He had given her a new way of seeing the world, and Rachel couldn't wait to take that perspective with her as she moved forward in her life.